all to this latest in our series of information sessions, which we've arranged at very, very short notice by way of an update. Nid i trefnu'r sesiwn hyn ar rhybydd byr iawn i'ch diweddaru chi. Just to let you know that we will be recording this session, so the recording will be available if you need it. I ni yn recordio'r sesiwn. We haven't got simultaneous translation available this afternoon. Does dim cyfieithu ar y pryd, ond mi fyddwn ni yn defnyddio'r Gymraeg a'r Saesneg. We will be delivering the session bilingually. If you have any questions, os bod na gwestiynau gyda chi, rhowch nhw on a column chat. If you do have any questions, please submit them in the chat column, and Lowri and Manon will be keeping an eye on any questions that come up during the session. Felly ar gwylog eich sgrin, fe welwch chi yn y canol yr opsiwn I wasgu ar chat. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see in the middle there's a function there, so you can press chat and submit your question. I ni hefyd yn mynd I fod yn defnyddio holi cwestiynau chi, defnyddio polls. We will also be asking you a few questions during the course of the session. And using polls. So I think, Teleri, you've got the first poll for us all to contribute to. And while everybody's contributing to that first question, just to remind everybody attending, we've set up this session as a webinar. Ni di sefydlu'r sesiwn yma fel webinar. So you won't be able to see yourselves, you'll only be able to see the panelists. So don't panic, everything's fine, and you'll still be able to contribute via the chat column. Felly pidwch poeni os bo chi ddim yn gweld eich hunain. We don't see you either, we just see the list of attendees. So if you can answer that first poll, os allwch chi llenwi'r poll cynta na, mi fydden ni'n ddiolchgar iawn. Felly ewn ni mlaen I pwrpas y sesiwn prynawn ma. I'll move on to cover the purpose of this afternoon's session. My name's Hazel Lloyd-Lebran, and I work for the Ceredigion Association of Voluntary Organisations, CAVO. And I chair a panel, an advisory panel that's been set up by the Public Services Board, representatives of which you can see on your screen. Dwi'n gweithio I Cymdeithas Mudiadau Gwirfoddol Ceredigion CAVO, a dwi'n gadeirydd ar panel yr PSB o bobl sydd yma i'ch cefnogi chi drwy'r proses, a fe welwch chi'r unigolion na ar y sgrin. Felly, ni wedi tynnu'r sesiwn ma at ei gilydd wedi'r cyhoeddiad Dydd Gwener diwetha. We've arranged this session at very short notice, following last Friday's Welsh Government announcement that from the 3rd of May, Dillun sy'n dod, ynddo fe? O'r trydydd o Mai, fydd na hawl I lan hyd at 15 o bobl I gwrdd tu fewn. From the 3rd of May, up to 15 people will be able to meet indoors to take part or to run organised activities. Organised activities that are arranged by a group, so there's a line of responsibility. Nid yw'r cyfanswm na o 15 yn cynnwys plant na'r sawl sy'n trefnu gweithgareddau. That maximum number of 15 doesn't include children under the age of 11 or those who are arranging these sessions. But I think it's really, really important to remember that the space that you will be holding the activity in will act as a cap for those numbers. Mi fydd y lleoliad ei hunan yn rhoi rhyw fath o cap ar y rhifau o'r sawl fydd yn gallu mynychu sesiynau. You need to make sure, we still need to make sure that people can be 2 meters apart, and that does include children under 11 and organisers. Mae'n dal yn bwysig bod ni'n sicrhau bod bobl yn gallu fod 2 fedr o'i gilydd o fewn y lleoliad. So 15 is definitely not a target. Dyw 15 ddim yn targed i ni gwrdd ag e. Mae WCVA yn diweddaru'r canllawiau. WCVA are at this very moment in time updating their guidance, but there won't be a huge change. The only things that will change significantly, there will be more reference to good ventilation. And there will also be reference to lateral flow testing and the vaccination status as well of people attending any activities. Felly mi newn ni rhannu'r canllawiau yna cyn gyntaf a fi nhw ar gael. We will be sharing those guidance as soon as it becomes available and has been updated and translated. So watch this space. I'd now like to move on to consider or to remind you of the key considerations. Ewn ni nawr mlaen I atgoffa'n hunain o'r prif pethau I ystyried fel I ni wrthi yn trefnu digwyddiadau neu gweithgareddau. So a reminder of key considerations, and Donna's going to take us through a few key points. Diolch, Donna. Oh, sorry, Donna, you're on mute.
I'm getting used to talking to you. So it's just a brief recap and a summary on the risk assessment process. So first things first, when we're looking at reopening the venues, is to ensure the building is clean, safe for people to enter and use by carrying out the building part of the risk assessment. We have got a template that you can look at. If you've already got one, then now's the ideal time to revisit it and review it to make sure that you're happy with how everything is and that you've got the things in place for it. So then we'll be moving on to now, as Hazel described, looking at what activities can take place and how they can take place safely. So you could share your building risk assessment with the activity coordinator, and you'd like to see their risk assessment too. You'd want to see reference to personal protective equipment, so that's your face coverings, your gloves and aprons for cleaning, social distancing, who might be attending, the hygiene things that they're going to put in place, and again ventilation, as Hazel has already referred to. So when we're looking at indoor activity applications, some of the key considerations we need to be thinking now is looking at limiting the amount of activities compared to how many you would have had being carried out in your venues, and reminding organisers to keep indoor activities to the least time possible. So they might have been used to having a physical activity session for up to 2 hours. Well, we're trying to reduce that sort of time when you might be exposed to infection. So we try to keep the activities to as short a length of time as possible if it has to be inside, because this will ensure the opportunity that you can clean in between each session, allow the opportunity to open up the doors and the windows to get some air changes in before, during and after each activity to reduce the risk of airborne infection. And also give you the opportunity to make sure that you're happy that touch points have been cleaned in between each group going in. So that's your tables, chairs, light switches, door handles, and sort of window handles, because we'll be expecting people to be opening and shutting windows, etc. So same as it was before. I mean, we may have new variants and all the rest of it. Our control measures are all the same. We just got to make sure that we're covering them. So the similar pattern of infection prevention control measures is, making sure that we're doing our best to keep things clean. We're adhering to social distancing, and as Hazel said, it's even if you've got children below 11 years old. So again, you might think that you might have space for 30 people in that room, but you know, it's not a competition. We need to be keeping the social distancing in place as well. You know, we need to be looking at face coverings, and of course, really important now is this lots of fresh air. Spring's coming, hopefully some warmer weather's coming. So we'll have the opportunity to make sure we open up those doors, open up those windows to allow for these air changes. So if there is any airborne virus in the air, we're getting rid of it, and air is going to be clean and fresh, ready for the next group of people to come in. Okay.
Excellent, diolch yn fawr iawn, Donna. Thank you very much, Donna. And you've just reminded me, I was at a meeting yesterday afternoon where colleagues from North Wales were informing us of a scam that they'd been made aware of through the Salvation Army. Salvation Army had been sent links to ventilation equipment and air conditioning equipment, and it was a scam because I should imagine, Donna, that we don't need to go into any, you know, we don't need to buy any equipment. It's just a case of making sure that there's an airflow going through the building so that windows are open and doors are open.
And if the buildings have been shut for a while, it's making sure that those windows can open.
Yes.
You know, window that swells, you get, you know, the casings that swell, you get the hinges that might need a bit of WD-40. So now is a chance to be going around and doing these little checks to make sure that air, you know, the doors and windows can be open, because, you know, fresh air is one of the best things historically to try and get rid of airborne particles, whether it's, you know, infectious viruses and bacteria, all sorts of things. So now is the time to make the most of fresh air to help us fight infection.
Particularly interesting, Donna, as you say, some of you may have taken the opportunity to give your buildings a lick of paint while they've been closed. So making sure that doors and window are still able to be open is an important one. I haven't seen the content of the scam. But apparently it was stating that in order to meet regulations, you needed this equipment. So just be aware. If anything comes through, then let us know, and we'll be able to advise you. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Donna. Thank you very much. Teleri, wyt ti eisiau cynnig y cwestiwn nesaf? Do you want to pause the next poll question? Felly, os allwch chi, please, rhannu eich atebion ynglyn â pryd i chi'n disgwyl ar agor. If you could please let us know, share details of when you are expecting or planning to reopen or restart your activities. That would be really, really helpful. Fel o'n i'n crybwyll ar y cychwyn, as I suggested right at the very beginning, this is one of a series of information sessions that we've organised. You may have attended a few of them. And one of our latest sessions gave a bit of an update, gave a bit of a briefing on the test, trace and protect process. Un o'r sesiynau diweddar wnaethon ni gyflwyno, mi gaethon ni diweddariad ar yr system o profi olrain a diogelu. Felly, o'n i eisiau eich atgoffa chi yn ystod y sesiwn hyn o'r gofynion. We just wanted to take this opportunity to remind you at this session of the test, trace and protect requirements. Again, we need to make sure that we keep a register of who is attending our sessions and when. Really important. We need to keep that information for 21 days. Angen I ni gadw'r gwybodaeth na am 20 o ddyddiau. And we need to think about the security of people's details as well. As we mentioned in our previous session, some of those lists are quite open, and we do know of instances where people's personal details, contact details, have been taken by individuals that have signed in after them. So it's really, really important that we have a confidential way of doing that, and that we don't share pens. Again, one of the things that we would have done quite naturally previously, but obviously not something that we're encouraging nawr. Felly, ystyriwch sut ych chi'n gallu casglu'r gwybodaeth na mewn ffordd sy'n diogel, a hefyd sydd ddim yn afynol I bobl I rhannu beiro I lenwi'r gwybodaeth. So think about how you collate that information securely and avoid using shared pens. Hefyd, pwynt pwysig iawn I wneud, very, very important point that was raised to my attention yesterday. I hadn't considered this. You may be quite familiar with the QR codes as you're out and about and going into shops and bars and restaurants. That in itself isn't sufficient. Dyw'r QR code I hunan ddim yn ddigonol. So you need to be collating that information about individuals that attend your sessions, as well as having a QR code. The QR code system isn't a replacement, and that's a really important point to make, to cover. We also wanted to remind everybody, some of you may also be acting as polling stations on the 6th of May. Efallai fydd rhai o chi hefyd yn gorsafod pleidleisio ar y 6ed o Fai. Mae fe dal yn ofynol I chi I aros ar gau am 3 diwrnod cyn diwrnod yr election a 3 diwrnod ar ôl yr election. We're still asking you to remain closed or not to hold any activities 3 days prior to polling day and 3 days afterwards. That allows all the changes that need to be made, all the adaptations, all the equipment to be delivered safely, and gives you enough time to prepare and to make sure that the space is cleaned afterwards. So we just wanted to remind you that it's still a requirement if you're acting as a polling station. Felly ni'n barod nawr I gymryd unrhyw gwestiynau. We are now ready to take any questions. Lowri, Manon, unrhyw beth wedi dod trwyddo?
Mae yna un cwestiwn wedi dod i'r blwch chat. There's one question so far that I can see, and that goes back to the point made earlier in regards to social distancing, pellter cymdeithasol. So the question is, what is the position with activities such as Cylch Ti a Fi regarding social distancing the toddlers in the hall?
We have similar situations in our primary schools, especially in the nursery ages, and we appreciate that it's going to be nigh on impossible to keep 2 meters away from very young children. So we're looking at putting additional control measures in, really. So it could be the use of face coverings in addition to the extra cleaning, the fresh air. If you've got a larger group, would it be possible to consider perhaps bubbling your nursery assistants? So to work with a regular group of children from one day to the next, perhaps. Also, if in our schools we've introduced the regular twice a week lateral flow testing, which it can identify people who are asymptomatic but might have a sort of COVID in the system. So we would probably recommend that carrying that out twice a week as well would be something to think about, because I think Welsh Government are wanting to carry that forward for people who aren't working in their own homes and might be dealing with anybody sort of face-to-face, public-facing. So that's a couple of extra considerations, but as you so rightly brought it up, trying to keep a very who wants your attention or has fallen and scuffed their knee, I think we have to be pragmatic here. There are other things we can put in place, and all you can do is your best at the end of the day.
And as you say, Donna, this is where the consideration of smaller groups that are kept together as bubbles is quite useful. But I think what's important is that the space is allowed for people to be 2 meters apart, even if with children, it's quite difficult to ensure that happens. We just need to make sure that the space is large enough for any number of people attending sessions. Cwestiwn nesa, next question.
Diolch am hwnna, a falle jyst i ychwanegu, as Donna mentioned earlier on, it's important that you as venues have sight of these risk assessments for any groups such as perhaps Cylch T a fi who are using your venues to make sure that you're comfortable and content with the plans that they have. So there are a number of questions coming through now, so I'll just go through them in order. Point yw'r nesa, it's a comment next, and that's just to suggest that Neu Atgoffa Pamparca won't be opening until the election. So diolch am gadarnhau hwnna Enid. Cwestiwn nesa ar ôl hwnna, the next question after that. What's the situation in regards to allowing choirs or singing parties to meet? So beth yw'r sefyllfa o ran caniatau corau neu partïon canu I gyfarfod? Yw'r cwestiwn nesaf.
Donna, shall I kick us off? Because quite interestingly, it was discouraged, wasn't it, when we were easing out of lockdown last time round. O'n I ddim yn annog core I ddod at I gilydd na unrhyw fath o unrhyw fath o chwithbrennau neu offerynnau chwaith. But it is different now. There is an allowance for parties and choirs to come together. Ma na ganllawiau ymwneud a partïon a corau yn dod at I gilydd. Eto, lan hyd at 15 o bobl, tu fewn, lan hyd at 30 tu allan, lle mae hwnna'n rhoi tyma bach fwy o opsiwn. We must remember, even with choirs and parties, it is still a maximum of 15 inside. And again, we need to be making sure that people are socially distanced. So I'm not sure how practically that works with choral practice. And one of the things that we were discussing yesterday, un o'r pethau ni'n trafod ddo, was the layout where you consider the activity and how you run the activity. So really, with and the same would apply for choirs or choral practice or physical activities. It's important that people aren't face to face. So you limit people being directly face to face to each other. So I think that all needs to be considered. Mae eisiau ystyried sut mae'r gweithgaredd yn cael ei redeg a faint mor ymarferol yw I dynnu bobl at ynghyd I bractisio eto. Donna, did you want to add anything to that?
Just adding on to what you've already said, you know, it would be meter social distancing isn't enough if you're using woodwind instruments or trumpets or anything like that, or when you're singing, you're raising your voice, so the power of the air that comes out of you is naturally going to be higher. If you've got somebody who's directing an orchestra or the choir and you're going to be needed to face them, you're going to need to be that further away, to be honest. And if you have got access to screens or anything like that as an additional control measure, and to keep these groups as small as possible, because we know that this extra sort of strength to the air that comes out is higher risk factors as well.
Thanks, Donna. Cwestiwn nesa?
Diolch. Cwestiwn nesa wedyn. I think this is in regards to the TTP. How precise does a register need to be?
Now, if I remember rightly, was there a template? Oedd na template o'n I wedi rhannu? Bearing in mind the purpose of keeping a register, I should imagine that it's all the details that makes it easy for somebody to be contacted. So phone number, mobile phone number, email address, so that the contact tracing teams can get in touch with people really easily, really quickly. So again, you know, it's not appropriate for one person to be registering on behalf of a number of other people. I think each individual directly, and it really is about those easy contact details. But I'm sure there's a template. Can anybody from the panel remember whether we had a template or not?
I think we did share it.
There is guidance available on it, and certainly what you said there is correct in terms of names, address, contact phone number, that sort of thing, and to keep those details for 21 days is the key sort of thing, and any organizer needs to make sure that that is available should any contact tracing officer or the Welsh Government get in touch to require that information. So there's an obligation to keep that information for 21 days.
Does dim ised dim byd ychwanegol nag oes o Efion, it is just the contact details and the when as well, when people were at the premises, so you can make the link between a case and precisely who was in that space at the same time.
Yeah, pwy sy'n a pryd yw'r peth pwysig, a bod ni'n gallu cysylltu gyda nhw, so you know, who's at what time, so that we can, so it's no good just saying PM, for example, because you may have a change of people throughout the afternoon. So it's important that we can place who was in that building with whom at the same sort of time, so that those, you know, obviously links can be made if it's necessary.
Okay, a question nessa. The next question, is it necessary to buy a fogging machine to disinfect the hall after each use, or is wiping down surfaces and touch points sufficient? I think we've had this question or a similar question in previous sessions. So, Donna, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, with fogging, we have to be really careful that we don't use it instead of cleaning. And, you know, cleaning the place thoroughly, using a good disinfectant and making sure we have fresh air flowing through that building in between each group is going to be much safer than using a fogging device, to be honest, because you're using chemicals, you're introducing more chemicals into the air than really you want to clean the air. So the cleaning down the touch points, having items in your hall that are easy to keep clean, so getting rid of your nice cushions, your soft chairs, etc. Having, you know, because people aren't going to be there for many hours on end, apart from on polling day, the poor presiding officers, that, you know, otherwise people are going to be in there for relatively short spaces of time, have plastic, metal, easy to clean chairs, and that will help keep that room that's being used cleaner. There's something I didn't mention earlier on as well, is try and reduce the amount of traffic into your kitchens. That's something I meant to mention earlier on, but I didn't, so all apologies. So yeah, for example, again, I'm using the polling day as an example. They need welfare facilities, so they will need access to toilets and perhaps the kitchens. But for everyday short-term activities, you know, they'll have to bring in their own water bottles and things like that. You wouldn't allow them to use your kitchen as standard, to pop the kettle on and use it as a bit of a meeting room whilst they make themselves a cup of coffee. So that'll help to reduce the risk of transmission as well.
Bring your own. Bring your own refreshments. It's probably a good approach, isn't it? But again, if we're keeping sessions, meetings, activities brief, then we are then also reducing the need for refreshments, toilet use, etc. So there's sense to that, isn't there? Lowri, unrhyw gwestiynau eraill?
Diolch. Ma sawl cwestiwn arall. Yr un nesaf te. The next question is in regard to lateral flow testing, which we've briefly touched on. And the question is, who carries out lateral flow tests? Are they the organisers, hirers, hall staff, or all? Yeah, that's the question.
Generally be led by the risk assessment. So, for example, if you had a exercise instructor wanting to use the hall for 8 people and their risk assessment's very good, they might say in their risk assessments that the night before or in the morning, they'll carry out a lateral flow test to, you know, they'd have to do that themselves. They'd have to get hold of the lateral flow tests themselves as well. So unless you had in your building and your staffing risk assessment that was what you're going to do, you'd be responsible for your own testing.
Am I right as well? A dwi'n iawn hefyd I weid bod yr profion ddim yn hanfodol. Am I right in saying that the lateral flow tests aren't essential? They're optional at the moment. So consider how and where they're used as well. Because one of the concerns that we have is if people get a negative result and that they're clear, it changes people's behaviour. And it's still really, really important that we wear face coverings, that we keep our distance, that we keep good hygiene. And the concern is that, you know, with a negative test, then people abandon those kinds of security measures, and it's vital that we keep to some of that. Mae agwedd bobl yn newid yn dyw oherwydd canlyniad profion. Therefore, it's not essential, it's optional.
Hazel, yeah, that's a good point as well, isn't it? That it certainly shouldn't replace the need for other measures. Question arall wedyn, when we're planning indoor activities, do we need to send in risk assessments or proposals to CAFO first?
No need to do that first, correct me if I'm wrong, panel. But we, as a panel, we meet once a week in cwrdd unwaith yr wythnos fel panel. Therefore, if you want any support or if you want us to take a look over any risk assessments, then we will be more than happy to do that, as long as you don't all rush at once. Ni'n fwy na hapus I bwrw golwg dros unrhyw asesiad risg.
Diolch Hazel, a just I ychwanegu hwnna falle for council funded projects or provision, we have requested site of risk assessments beforehand for those who are funded through various local authority services and teams. Another question is in regards to contact sports. What about contact sports? I'm not sure if we're able to answer that.
Awful lot of guidance around contact sports, but I know first time round, you know, potentially trying to avoid it, and how many people would be involved. So what sort of contact sports would you have with a maximum of 15 people?
Yeah, you know, the message at the moment is unless it's organised teams and the different federations that will have guidance around specific sports. So it'll depend on the sport, but if you're not an organised club or team, then I would suggest that contact sports isn't really an area to, you know, it's not an activity to arrange at the moment. Leave that one to the, well, not just the professionals, but the amateurs as well. But depending on the sport, the different governing bodies and federations will have specific guidance on risk assessment and things to consider. Mae'n dibynnu fi'n credu ar y fath o chwaraeon I chi'n ystyried.
Okay, diolch. Question nesa, can exercise classes similar to Zumba take place? And the second part of that question is, when do you envisage the possibility of holding meetings for up to 25 or more? So there's two parts to that question.
Na I gychwyn gyda'r ateb i'r ail rhan. I'll start with the answer to the second part. I think Welsh Government have already announced that post-election, but it will depend on who will be elected into positions of power. But the plan is, the hope is then, if rates continue along the same trajectory, that they would increase the maximum number of attendees for indoor activities, organised indoor activities, to 30. on the, is it the 17th of May? I've got the 17th of May in my head. I think it's the 17th of May. And then outdoor organised activities would increase from 30 to 50. But again, the same restrictions will be in place in terms of space, and your location itself will put a cap on how many people can attend any organised activities. Donna, the Zumba classes.
With regard to, well, the more exertion, the higher the risk because of the airborne particles. So again, it's making sure that you've got at least 2 metre social distancing. And I would say before that exercise class, I would expect to see in the coordinator's risk assessment, they're asking people, making sure they're fit and healthy before the class takes place. And anybody who you're worried, you ask them nicely that perhaps, you know, next week you can come back again when you're feeling a bit better or something like that. And of course they'd have to go home and consider whether they need to have a test done, etc. For the person who's carrying out the exercise class, you'd want them to consider their social distancing, if they're going to be facing their group of people as well, or perhaps if they could face away and lead them so that they could see from behind that sort of exercise, which is something that can be carried out and you know, and does happen. So you would expect, you know, not just the minimum requirements, but actually them considering that the risk is a little bit higher, and I'll put these extra considerations in, especially, you know, the opening up of windows and doors, and the cleaning of touch points down before and after their session as well.
Diolch. Again, a question, I think, in regards to TTP, which may have been covered a little bit already, is do hall committees need to ask event organisers, so those using the halls, I presume, to submit their attendee records to them?
I would say no on that score, because you are collecting confidential information, personal information. So that should be done by the individuals organising the event or the group organising an event. And that's why we are saying, you know, the guidance, the regulations are still referring to organised activities. So you will have somebody in a position of responsibility that will hold that information. So that's really important that that's kept by the organisers of the activity, and it doesn't need to be passed on to the hall or the community centre committee. And then it's probably worth reminding those who are booking activities or booking space in your halls or community centres that they need to be keeping a register of those attending.
Diolch, Hazel. This next question, I think Donna has covered to an extent when referring to the election. So the question is around tea and coffee and refreshments, that some small groups who would ordinarily use the hall would have access to tea and coffee and refreshments. Is there any further guidance or anything you want to expand on that, Donna?
I think each polling station should have its own sort of risk assessment or following guidance that our election officers have been working towards. So there, you know, there is a sort of expectation potentially for some sort of welfare facility because it's an all-day, you know, it's something that's going to be going on all day. So I think you'd have to refer to the most up-to-date guidance really on that.
Yeah, and I think, Donna, as we were suggesting earlier, for other activities, other gatherings, other meetings, then it's best to avoid that, you know, the kitchen area and the sharing and the handling of the kettle and any sharing of refreshments. If people have to, then it's probably best to suggest that people bring their own. We just need to make sure that we're limiting those potential risks, and if we can if we can encourage people to bring their own refreshments, then it's safer. Mae'n fwy ddiogel yn dywes bod ni'n annog bobl I ddod â rhywbeth I yfed neu rhywbeth I fyta I hunain, a dim defnyddio'r gegin a rhannu unrhyw fath o refreshments.
Na ni, diolch. The next question, groups, for example, community councils and so on, are requesting to hold AGMs at the hall. As it's technically possible to hold it via Zoom, but preferable and easier for face-to-face, what should we advise? So I think that's a good question, really, because I think as a panel, we would encourage that if it's possible to hold something virtually, then that should be the first option. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Cytuno'n llwyr, Lowri, os bod e'n bosib i wneud e'n digidol wedyn cadwch at digidol. If it's possible to do it digitally, then stick to digital. Because one of the things that I'm struggling with at the moment, although meetings can take place indoors, I struggle to think about how they would work practically when everybody has to be 2 meters apart and wearing face coverings. I'm not quite sure how a meeting would work in practice. So I think with something like an AGM, it needs to be open to anybody that's involved in your organization. You would then be limiting that AGM to up to 15 people. So it seems quite exclusive then, rather than inclusive. So be happy to have a chat with you about AGMs separately. Sorry, Avion.
Yeah, the other thing to bear in mind is that the legal obligation to take all reasonable measures still exists, and that needs to be borne in mind with any activity that's going on anyway. And in that circumstance, you could argue that if it can be done virtually, why are you getting together and causing an unnecessary risk?
Yeah, that's the reasonable measure.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, midnight on May the 2nd.
Oh, sorry. Oh.
We are only going from alert level, opening up completely of measures. We're still at alert level 3, which when we were going up, everybody was regarding as really stringent and really tight. So, you know, that needs to be borne in mind, I think.
Yeah, diolch Efion. Nethon ni dy golli di fyna am ychydig. We lost you there for a moment, a technical hitch, but yeah, important point about, you know, we will still be in alert level 3. So we're not moving down at any great pace down the alert level, are we?
Diolch bawb. There's a request then to share a possible template for the track and trace, and what we can do is we can ensure that we have something on the web page where all these resources will be accessible to you, so that's certainly possible. I think the next question has been covered, and that's in regards to who's responsible for keeping a register, and I think we have covered that. Right, okay, the next question then. As a whole trustee, if users give us a risk assessment and we then assume they're adhering to it, are we liable if they don't? Should we do spot checks?
You wouldn't need to undertake spot checks. You know, they've taken on this responsibility by completing this document. And, you know, we'd be putting you at additional risk, asking you to do these spot checks as well. If there were any complaints raised or anything like that, you know, that could be reported and perhaps we could help, you know, the sort of follow-up sort of thing. But if you do have, if you are told by somebody who went to an activity in your venue and that, you know, it's quite obvious that things weren't being adhered to in line with that risk assessment, you would be well within your rights to say, you know, and, you know, I can't allow this to happen until you've put the correct control measures in that you've already written about in your risk assessment. But, you know, they've written in that risk assessment, they've outlined their control measures, and there has to be that sort of responsibility on their part to adhere to them.
Thanks, Donna. I'm just wondering as well, Avion, in terms of, you know, worst case scenario and any kind of enforcement, there would be a closure notice on the activity itself rather than the venue or the building. Would I be right in suggesting that, Avion?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there for a sec. There are various enforcement options available, and I think it would be assessed on a case-by-case basis, really, as to who had, for example, if they were looking at the premises and they thought, right, there are things here which should have been sorted at the premises, then they may well consider a closure order on the premises itself. If it is the event that is causing an issue or concerns regarding that issue, then there are direction notices that could be served to prevail. So it is a case-by-case basis, really, of assessing, what the issues are on individually as to what enforcement option might be taken.
Okay, diolch Eifion.
Diolch. Couple of cwestiynau nesa. The next couple of questions, I think, are specifically in regards to regulation again. And the first is in regards to birthday parties. So I don't know if you want to take that one first, and then I'll ask the second.
The regulations state that that the activity must be organised. So must be an organised activity by a group. We've talked about enforcement, we've talked about TTP registers. There has to be somebody with responsibility behind the organisation. So any personal gatherings at the moment aren't allowed. Because any party again would involve refreshments, wouldn't it, or those activities which would mean that people wouldn't be socially distancing. So at the moment, it's about organised activities with a group, an identified group or body arranging those activities or meetings.
Diolch, Hazel. And there's then a question in regards to that activities are being held outside, but there's a little bit of pressure for people to use the toilets of the venue. So what's the most recent advice, if we can answer, in regards to toilet use if activities are being held outdoor?
It's whether you've got the resources to make sure that they are cleaned thoroughly and frequently throughout that time. And this is where, problems are arising, is that, people haven't got cleaners on standby, and you haven't got caretakers or anything like that to be going in and cleaning the toilet all the time. So whether in the risk assessment it says that people are warned that there is no toilet on site, or whether you are able to have that extra resource to support the use of the toilet, because the important thing is that it's kept very clean indeed.
And as well as part of that risk assessment, that there are plenty of notices about, that there's a system to make sure that people aren't congregating outside the toilet cubicle if they're waiting, if that there's a queuing system. And I've also seen various public toilets as well with wash basins. If there are 3 or 4, a few of them are taken out of action, so people aren't stood too close together when they're washing their hands. So for me as well, it would be that avoiding that traffic into the building and the opportunities for people to congregate within the building. So that needs to be considered. So certainly not a no, but yeah, some thinking needs to be done behind that to make it possible and safe.
Diolch. There's a quick question here then in regards to polling stations, and that their venue would be used as a polling station. They have signage, but they ask whether the council will provide floor spacing markers, i.e. sticky marked tape. So I think what we would advise there is Glynis from the department that's been liaising with all polling stations will be able to advise you there. So perhaps if you want to direct your query to Glynis, so certainly we can do on your behalf. I'm sure Glynis will be able to provide some advice of what resources is being provided to venues to be used as a polling station. And Avion has provided some very useful links in regards to TTP requirements in the chat bar that you should all be able to see, so please do take a look at them. I think they are the questions. Some questions we've just grouped together because they're quite similar. Manon, ydw i wedi colli unrhyw gwestiynau yn y chat bar fanna?
A lot around toilets, but we have answered the toilets questions. There was another one. What is the latest guidance on using masks during physical activity?
So this is where, again, the physical the risks are higher, as I said, about breathing, but as you're breathing heavily in and out, your mask is going to get wetter as well, so it's not going to be working properly. It can make breathing more difficult. So what they're saying is, when you go into the room, into the building, you're wearing your mask, and just before the exercise class starts, you can remove it, but you must put it back on again on leaving the room or moving around. So for the actual exercise part itself, you don't, the guidance states, you don't need to be using it. And then again, this is where this at least 2 meter social distancing, cleaning the touch points and having the windows and doors open to allow that ventilation, so that this exhaled air is all taken out from the room as well.
Thank you, Donna. And then there's just one more then. Are there specific guidelines or regulations regarding lateral flow tests for village hall managers or users?
I think we spoke about this earlier on, that it's not mandatory, voluntary, and can be used as an additional control measure to provide reassurance of when you're working with the higher risk areas. So again, it's a recommendation. I know Public Health Wales are encouraging it, who have to have face-to-face contact with people as part of their work, etc. So that's something for you to consider further down the line, and we'll just keep an eye on guidelines and legislation to see if any of that changes in the future.
Diolch. I think we have worked through the questions.
So, sorry, I was just going to say there that the alert level 3, which is what we're going to that of May now, Welsh Government haven't yet published their updated guidance relating to those changes. So there may be more information coming available very soon, as always with coronavirus, I'm afraid. But we don't know what slight changes they might suggest, but keep your eye out for those.
I noticed as well a very interesting question about a pregnant Zumba instructor. If she is the one organising the activity, then the responsibility is hers. If you employ that instructor, then it might be worth having a discussion just to make sure that all the potential risks have been identified and that everybody's safe. And yeah, cwestiwn diddorol fyna, very interesting question. Have we worked our way through everything else? Ydyn ni wedi gweithio trwy popeth arall?
There's certainly the questions anyway, but as you mentioned earlier, Hazel, as a panel, we do meet weekly. So if anything crops up or you think of at a later date, then you have the details of how to ask those questions. But in regards to the questions, I think they should all be covered.
Great, diolch yn fawr iawn, Lowri a Manon, am gadw llygad fyna. Thank you both for keeping an eye out for those questions. And thank you very much for submitting the questions as well. Diolch i chi am rannu'r cwestiynau. Really useful, interesting questions and discussion. Teleri, ydy e'n bosib i cynnwys manylion cyswllt ni yn y column chat.
Na beth ni'n neud.
Have you already done it? Ti di neud yn barod? Great minds think alike, Clary. Yeah, just i gloi, fel oedd Laurie'n gweud, just to close as Laurie just mentioned, we as an advisory panel continue to meet and have always continued to meet have always been meeting on a weekly basis to discuss any developments and to address any queries that we've had through from you. So os bod gyda chi unrhyw gwestiwn neu unrhyw beth i chi sy'n ei ystyried, wedyn cysylltwch a Cafo, a wedyn newn ni rannu'r newn ni wedyn mynd â hwnna at y cyfarfod panel nesa. If you do have any questions or queries, then contact Cafo and we'll take it to the next panel meeting. We meet every Tuesday afternoon. And we are here to support you. Ni ma i'ch cefnogi chi. Hefyd, cofiwch yr adnoddau sydd ar y gwefan yn barod. Please remember the resources that are already available on the Ceredigion County Council website. We'll have a little check about the latest information around lateral flow testing, just to make sure that that's available on the website as well. A hefyd, cofiwch bod yna grantiau ar gael i'ch cefnogi chi i ailgychwyn eich gweithgareddau hefyd, neu wneud unrhyw newidiadau. Remember that there are grants available as well to help you with any costs associated with restarting your activities or making any adaptations to your buildings. Felly cysylltwch a Cafo, contact Cafo for that information as well. Felly, fi'n credu bod hwnna'n dod â ni at terfyn y sesiwn. I think that brings us to the end of the session. Sorry, Avion, were you going to come in there? You look as if you were going to put your hand up. Nah, ti'n all right. So that brings us to the end of the session, and I'd like to again thank you very much for spending an hour of your time with us this afternoon at the briefing session. Diolch o galon I chi am ymuno â ni prynhawn ma. Mae fe dal yn hanfodol bod ni'n neud pob dim I cadw pawb yn ddiogel. Even though the statistics, the numbers are thankfully moving and staying in the right place and moving in the right direction, it is still vital that we do everything that we can to keep everyone safe. So again, any queries, any questions, let us know. Unrhyw gwestiynau, unrhyw beth o gwbl wedyn cysylltwch. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi a cadwch yn ddiogel. Thank you very much and stay safe.